who appeared to Joshua.
Yeah, who is the captain of the Lord's army.
Yes.
So there are three kind of possible answers here, but the bridge, or rather the river, is going to split here very early on with whether it was an angel or God. And then if you think it's God, then it splits one.
Welcome to TBC Extra, a weekly podcast of our Sunday sermon and a little extra. I am Teresa Jenkins, the communications director here at Topeka Bible Church.
And I'm Jason Brent, the children's pastor at Topeka Bible Church, and we're glad you're here. And now for a little extra.
Hello, friends. We are so glad that you tuned in. Hi, Jason.
Hi, Teresa.
It's a Harvester's Day.
It's a cold Harvester Day.
It's a cold Harvester's Day. As many of you know, we record this podcast on Tuesdays, which means during the winter when we must wear our winter apparel. My hair is a little flatter. Yours looks perfectly fine.
Well, I honestly put some water on. It was real staticky because of my stocking cap. So
yeah,
mine
really looked like something.
When it dries out, probably next second, it'll be all crazy again. Mm-hmm. So that'll be why.
Yep. Well, here we are preparing for another winter storm in Topeka, Kansas.
Yes.
And we're hoping that we don't get totally covered with snow. It probably won't be as bad as the blizzard that we had a few weeks ago,
I would doubt it, but
we will be digging out.
It looks like it. Probably. I mean, I always am like very leery to say we for sure are getting snow, even when it's like looks for sure on the radar, because we don't have any snow yet. But it looks like we're probably going to get some snow.
We have 100% chance of salvation when we follow Jesus.
That's right.
There is no probable, no likely. It is a fact.
And you don't have to wait till 3:00 tomorrow morning.
No, you don't. And you don't have to dig very far. I really keep trying to get us back to this digging thing.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
No, it's my fault. I don't get us there. We're tired. We have harvester's brain. Can we call it that?
Harvester brain.
It's ridiculous. We have a sermon today in which Connor will talk a little bit of archaeology.
Which was very exciting to me.
I'd rather dig through dirt than snow.
Sure. Yeah, there you go.
Depending on how cold it is.
Depending how hot it is.
Yeah.
Having dug in my backyard to put a pool in, I don't know if I agree with that. But
have you done a lot of digging around? I know you dug a lot.
Yeah, dug a lot. Yes, we have dug a lot.
You dug a lot. Can you dig it? Did you ever dig something that you totally did not expect to dig up?
Well, as we were talking before, I've never found buried treasure or anything like that. But so my elementary school, when I was growing up, had woods behind it, and we lived very close to my elementary school. And I think I've told several stories about our trouble we've gotten into at North Fairview Elementary School. But we would ride our bikes up to the school, and then we would go into the woods. And there was a part that had just a little teeny barbed wire fence you could get over very easy. And there was washing machines and dryers thrown out there and old stuff. And one time my brother and I were over there just exploring, and I found a machete, and I hid it, and I came back the next day with my backpack, and I took the machete, and I planned it because what fifth grade boy would not want something that you could just cut down trees with and hurt yourself with accidentally?
That's amazing.
It was really fun. Yes.
Fine.
A rusty machete with no handle. But my brother and I made it like a duct tape handle for it.
Why not?
And we would go out in the back of our house and play with the machete for weeks.
Who doesn't?
And we hid it. No. We both were under.
They do now.
Yeah, now. Well, they found out because we had a clubhouse shed, and we'd hide it under there. We would hit trees and stuff and throw it and try to stick it in trees and boys what you probably would do if you had a machete.
Yeah.
And I started my brother would challenge me to see how hard I could hit trees. Well, I hit a small tree. It was a very small tree, a sapling basically, and it almost went through it.
Okay.
And then he's like, we should cut it down. So we cut this small tree down, but then it was oh wait, people are going to probably wonder why this tree, it was obviously cut and chopped down. And so we kind of like tried to like make it look like it fell over the fence. But my dad called us out there. Was like, what is going on? And how did you cut this? And that kind of thing. So we showed him the machete, and he wasn't actually that upset about it. He's like, well, just be very careful with it.
Wow.
So we didn't have to give it up.
No tetanus shots needed.
I don't remember after cutting that tree down and then finding it, though. I don't remember going out and playing with it very much anymore. So I don't think we really. Yeah, it was probably the secret.
It wasn't like a forbidden fruit anymore.
No, I guess
forbidden machete.
A rusty, forbidden. A lot of iron on that fruit.
My babysitter when I was little, and so this would be like 5 years old before kindergarten.
Yeah.
On Oakland, for all of you who grew up in that part of town. Her house had just a nice size yard, and apparently she allowed me to go out with a trowel and just dig, because I have a memory of digging. A trowel,
not a shovel.
No, because I was tiny.
Yeah.
So like a little garden
little garden shovel. Yeah.
So I'm out there digging around, and I remember finding a metal cup, and I thought
that's awesome.
Like this was something maybe the pioneers, because I'd read enough like Little House
on the Prairie. There you go.
And I thought like maybe this was something of pioneers, but it was really brightly colored. It was like I'm thinking it was like green or purple. It was metal.
Oh wow.
And some of our older viewers might remember, like, there used to be metal cups. It wasn't Tupperware, but it was some company that sold stuff like that. And you'd get these metal cups that came in jewel tones.
Yeah.
And
metal,
they were
though,
really,
not Fiesta
they were
ware.
metal. No, not Fiesta ware, not Tupperware. They were metal. And it was, you probably could have cut your lip on the edge of it if you tried really hard. But she had a tumbler like that was this big, and it was purple or green. I can't remember. But I went running in the house with this big find. And
wow.
So she's in her 80s. This is in 1975. And her son had buried that in the backyard. She remembered that he had buried it in the backyard.
Wow.
And somehow, I don't know how it didn't rust, whatever kind of finish it was.
Good for the enamel or whatever they put on that.
She thought that was
for years. And it was years ago or before?
Yeah,
or
so
like...
it had probably been there 70 years. I know. Isn't that amazing? So,
and what the chance of you digging right in that spot?
The timelines aren't lining up now in my head, but maybe it was a grandson who buried it. Because I'm thinking this cup was probably from the 1940s.
Do you still have it?
Oh, no. I gave it back to her.
Oh, gave it to her. I gotcha.
Said her, I know, finders and keepers, but it was her land, and possession is 9/10 of the law. So we did honor that law.
Very nice.
I'm sure she gave me a piece of candy or something instead in trade for it. But we would love to know, what have you dug up? Hopefully on property you had permission to dig on. And here's something else you can dig, and that is Connor's sermon. Here it is.
Was pumping. Hey, good morning. Glad to be with you. I'm excited to continue our series in Joshua this morning, because we've got one of those stories that let's say if you grew up at a time where there were a lot of felt diagrams in the children's ministry, you've probably seen it before, heard it before. But we're going to be in Joshua chapters 5 and 6, looking at the Battle of Jericho. But first, if any of you did track in high school or consider yourself a runner, you probably know the name Roger Bannister. He was a guy back in 1954. He ran the first sub 4-minute mile. Officially, nobody had ever done it before in history. And Roger, when he did that in 1954, he broke a barrier that many people thought was like a physical impossibility. It is not, the human body cannot go under 4 minutes. But what a lot of people don't know is that in the next within the next year, 12 people broke the 4-minute mile. In fact, just 46 days after Roger Bannister's record, there was a guy in Australia who beat him by 2 full seconds, which is a huge margin at that time. And so what Roger sort of breaking this barrier, what it showed was that for the people that are at that level, the barrier to the 4-minute mile was more mental than it was physical. There was a battle that they maybe didn't realize they needed to be fighting that was more important. And when it comes to the battles in our life today, there are many that we face that are far more difficult and important than running a very fast mile time. But the exact same truth applies, that there is something going on behind the scenes. There is something that is even more important for us to consider, which is that at the root cause of all of the difficulties that we have in this fallen world is an enemy. And that there is a spiritual battle going on that we often don't recognize. And in particular, the enemy that we often don't recognize. In chapters 5 and 6 of Joshua, the nation of Israel is going against what seems to be an impossible task, which is taking the fortress of Jericho in the Promised Land. It's a mighty city. It is ready for any type of battle, and they know that Israel is coming. But instead of engaging in warfare the way that we might expect, drill, sharpen your weapons, let's talk about strategy, they march around it for 7 days, and then ultimately the walls come crumbling down. And what it shows us is that there is a true battle and a true war that is being fought that often goes beyond what we see and we recognize. And if we can see that true battle and fight that true battle, then we can have ultimate victory over these kinds of things. By God's power, we will be able to see victory in the land. So that's where we're looking in Joshua chapters 5 and 6 today. But as we get into chapter 5 here, I'll warn you, this is not normally where you start the story of Jericho falling. That actually happens in chapter 6. Chapter 5 is about the preparation for battle. But as we'll see, it becomes just as important as the battle itself. Chapter 5, verse 1, it says, "When all the Amorite kings across the Jordan to the west and all the Canaanite kings near the sea heard how the Lord had dried up the water of the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, they lost heart and their courage failed because of the Israelites." So Israel, talked about last week, crossed the Jordan River. The Lord sort of provided this miraculous bookend to their wilderness journey. It began by crossing the Red Sea, and now it finishes by crossing the Jordan River. And we know that these miraculous events have preceded the nation of Israel, such that those who live in the Promised Land are terrified of them because the God behind them, or in many cases in front of them rather, is doing things that nobody could ever imagine and are surely will prove to be too mighty for the gods of the Canaanites and the Amorites to go up against. Because it's important to remember, and it is so critical to understanding the Battle of Jericho, nobody is looking at this from a military strategy perspective. Everybody in the Promised Land and everybody in Israel recognizes that it is going to be basically their God fighting another God. The truth that we know is that you have the one true God of Israel who's going against these demonic forces who are kind of masquerading behind and have confused the Canaanites. They're being worshipped as idols of wood and stone and metal and all of these things, but they're really no gods at all. They have names like Dagon and Baal and Asherah, but ultimately what we have is the battle between the true God and a bunch of false ones, ultimately backed by Satan. And it's critical that you see this background, this foundation, because as we get into chapter 5 here, there are going to be a lot of questions that you might have that come up, such that when we read verse 1, you go, okay, so everybody in Jericho is terrified of them? If we were thinking about this from, I don't know, like Napoleon's perspective or something, you'd be like, all right, strike now while the iron is hot. Like, they're scared, let's roll in on them. Let's take advantage of this opportunity. But instead, what we see happen is God instructs the nation of Israel to have minor surgery and then a party. The first item on their checklist to prepare for the Battle of Jericho is everyone needs to get circumcised, right? I know this probably doesn't appear on your Super Bowl checklist, okay? But this is very important to the nation of Israel. If you're not familiar with the Bible, it's probably even weirder, but circumcision was a sign of individual loyalty and faith to the God of the covenant, right? It was a sign that you had trusted in the Lord and were with him. You had aligned yourselves with his purpose and made an irreversible decision to follow him, right? This was something that goes back to Genesis, where Abraham was told to become circumcised in order to show his faith in the Lord. And throughout the next hundreds of years, through Egypt even, we know that this was a practice that Israel took part in. So much so that Moses, back in Exodus chapter 4, God threatened to kill him because he had not yet circumcised his own children, and yet he was about to lead the nation of Israel out of slavery. God really cares about this. And bigger problem, nobody who crossed the Jordan River was circumcised. None of the males had taken this step during all of the time that they had gone through the wilderness, during all of the years that they had the opportunity. None of them had taken this step of faith. And you go, okay, well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that we have a spiritual warfare that is about to take place. The battle with Jericho is not going to be fought by the strength of man, but by the strength of God. And so if you're about to conduct holy war, you better make sure you're aligned with the Lord. And yet you have an entire army of people who have made the decision, or nobody has led them at the very least, to say, yes, we have renewed our covenant with God. And so they do this. They get circumcised. And furthermore, adding into this idea that if you're thinking just from a human perspective, this doesn't make sense, this is something that sidelines them for a week or more. I mean, you can't just go running like Roger Bannister after this takes place. And so you're within a couple miles of an enemy that wants to throttle you, and then you have surgery and you need to recover. And we also see in the text that this takes place at a location that they want to remember. They give it such a name called the Hill of Foreskins, which, imagine being the guy whose task it was to name that location. Be like, hey, what do you think we should call this place? He's looking around, all around him. This is the only place in the Bible where this location receives that title. Every other time it is referred to as Gilgal, which has to do with the Hebrew word for rolling away a stone. But in this case, God is talking about rolling away the shame that Israel had for not following after him. Nevertheless, as they are camped at Gilgal, which will be a prime location throughout the rest of the book of Joshua, it is not just their circumcision that takes place, but also they have a religious feast. They celebrate Passover. Now, Passover is an unbelievably important holiday in the Jewish calendar, and even today we recognize Passover. Jesus died during Passover. He was the Passover lamb, ultimately. But Passover got started about 40 years earlier. It was during the 10th plague while they were in Egypt. And as God was told Pharaoh, told the entire nation of Egypt that the firstborn would die, he gave an instruction for how to exempt yourself from this judgment. He said, if you put the blood of the lamb over your doorpost, when the angel of the Lord comes through, he will pass over your household. And so it's not just a sign of God's judgment, but ultimately his redemption and his rescue of Israel from Egypt. This is why one of the things that they were supposed to do to celebrate Passover was bake unleavened bread. The idea behind that is you're in a hurry, right? You need to, which is what happens in Exodus, you need to hustle out of here once this takes place. And so for time immemorial, basically, as you celebrated Passover, you were supposed to bake unleavened bread. What makes this Passover so interesting is that, or really two things. One, it mimics the very first Passover, and that back then everybody got circumcised and then celebrated Passover, right? But the second thing, and more interesting to our story, is that this is the very first time that the grain they used to make their bread came from the Promised Land. And so in fact, the day after they ate the Passover feast, the manna, which had been the miraculous sort of bread-like flaky substance that God had given to Israel to feed them for 40 years in the desert, the day after this Passover, the manna ceases. Israel has arrived in the Promised Land. They're now sharing in the fruit of the land, and they have made it. But this preparation for battle, what it serves to do is not sort of fill our minds with the ideas of sharpening swords and laying out maps and talking about siege tactics, right? What this is doing is preparing them for a different kind of battle, the one that we don't often think about. This battle was not against flesh and blood, but the spiritual enemies of heaven. This kind of warfare doesn't use normal weapons or strategy. Yes, it doesn't use normal weapons, but it does use spiritual weapons. And so that ends up being the way that we think about the story of Jericho. And here in a moment, as we roll into chapter 6, and you hear God tell Joshua that they need to do things like just walk around the city for a week, you go, what's the purpose? It sounds crazy, right? Well, if you're thinking about it as a normal kind of battle, but as God is about to tell Joshua in a very dramatic way, there's more going on here than meets the eye. At the end of chapter 5, Joshua has a very interesting conversation with an individual that is either an angel of the Lord or the Lord himself. When Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man, it might be Jesus, we'll talk about that in the podcast. He looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua approached him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied. "I have now come as commander of the Lord's army." Then Joshua bowed with his face to the ground in homage and asked him, "What does my Lord want to say to his servant?" The commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, "Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did that. So this individual that speaks to Joshua, we don't know the identity. There are arguments for a couple different places, but the true fact is that this individual represents God no matter what. And as Joshua asks him this question in the plains, apparently this figure does not look angelic or does not look divine, because he thinks that maybe it could be an enemy from Jericho. They have their sword drawn at the ready. So he asks this question, right? This is the most interesting part here, is he goes, "Are you for us or for them?" And they respond with neither, which is frankly a confusing translation, because the word in Hebrew is simply no. It's not neither, which gives the impression of sort of this dodgy answer, evasive, right? Like, well, I'm not with you, Joshua. I'm not with them. The answer, I think, what we're being told here is that Joshua needs to understand something bigger than what he can realize. The individual comes and Joshua says, "Are you for us or for them?" And he goes, "No, it's more important than that. I am with the Lord's army. I am with the divine host." And it is at that point in time that Joshua is speaking to the real commander, that he recognizes that he is not the real commander of Israel's army. It is God himself. And so this leads into chapter 6. Joshua, furthermore, is given a moment very similar to Moses. You might recall in Exodus, the burning bush, when the Lord appears to Moses there. And what is Moses supposed to do? Take off his shoes because he's standing on holy ground. And so we have another parallel account with God's new leader of Israel. But as I've said, what I'm trying to show here is simply that what is about to happen at Jericho is done by God's strength, God's design, and that it is far more. It is a physical battle. There will still be swords that are slashing at the end of all of this, but first and foremost, it is a spiritual battle against the forces of evil. And so that is what we take into Joshua chapter 6 as we look at Jericho and all of the commands that the Lord gave to Joshua. Jericho was strongly fortified because of the Israelites, no one leaving or entering. The Lord said to Joshua, "Look, I have handed Jericho, its king, and its best soldiers over to you. March around the city with all the men of war, circling the city one time. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horn trumpets in front of the ark. But on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times while the priests blow the ram's horns. When there is a prolonged blast of the horn and you hear its sound, have all the troops give a mighty shout. Then the city wall will collapse and the troops will advance, each man straight ahead." So Israel is going to be the instrument of God's judgment and deliverance. They are a mighty stone that kills 2 really big birds. In the one hand, they are going to be an extension of God's judgment upon the land, sort of serving his divine will upon those who have built up their sins. This is something that we hear about the Canaanites and the Amorites and all of the different people groups that are here in the promised land, the land of milk and honey, is that way back in Genesis, when God made his original promise to Abraham that he would return his descendants to the land that he was in, one of the interesting things that God says is the Canaanites, their sins have not yet reached their full measure, and therefore it is not time for them to be removed yet. By the time that Israel comes around, it's roughly 600 years later, and apparently the Canaanites have sacrificed enough of their children, have done enough detestable things that God says, now it is time. You're going to be removed. But the other thing that the army of Israel is going to do is deliver the promise into God's people of the promised land. He is returning them to their homeland. They're going to take out the squatters who hate them and hate their God. But as you're reading about Jericho, if you're looking at this from probably the average person's perspective, it is a fortress that is well suited to handle any kind of battle. Most of the battles that occur during this time in history are sieges, right? They wait people out. And Jericho is ready for that kind of thing. They've got huge walls. We know because Rahab was drying grain during the spring, on her household when the spies visited, that it must be springtime. And so they have gathered all of this grain into their city, and Jericho has a well. So they've got water, they've got food, and they've got big walls. They're ready to roll, okay? But God's perspective, God's battle plan, is that he's going to take down those walls and he's going to destroy that city in a week without a single hand being raised until the very end. And in order to do that, there's a lot of symbolic pieces that are in this description, right? It's 7s over and over and over again, because 7 in the Bible is like this number of fullness or completion. When it's used, it's kind of representative of this bigger idea that when 7 priests go forward, or they march for 7 days, or they go around 7 times, or have 7 shofars, the ram's horns, like God is present in this place. It is symbolic of his meaning and purpose behind all of these things. And then notice what is leading the pack. It's the Ark of the Covenant. Talked about that last week, right? The Ark of the Covenant, the sign, the symbol of God's physical presence. That was what they touched the waters of the Jordan first and parted them. It was what has led Israel through the desert all of these years. It sits in the Holy of Holies in the middle of the tabernacle, and then later on in the temple. And now, as they're walking around Jericho, the Ark of the Covenant is leading the way. So it's not a military campaign. It is not even, though there are soldiers there, it's not like they're waging war. God says, you're going to carry a big box that represents me, and the priests are going to do it, and the army's going to fall in behind. Don't talk to them. Don't throw any stones at them. Be silent. And then at the very end, I am going to show you that I am here. He also tells them at the beginning, Look, I have handed Jericho, its king, and its best soldiers over to you, right? You've already won this war. To the God who is outside of time and yet speaks and loves people who are within it, Jericho had already fallen. This is much the same way, which will become very important in a moment, that we talk about the defeat of Satan. That when we read Revelation and hear about God's victory, it is not something that is, or rather it is something that is yet to happen only to us. But to God, Satan is already defeated. In much the same way with Jericho. They have already fallen. The walls have already come crumbling down. And all of this, honestly, it's hard to believe, right? Anytime we read about a miracle, it can stretch our faith. God, did you really do this sort of thing? And obviously the answer is yes, he can, and he does over and over. But what is such a gift to us is when he gives us evidence that this is so clearly taken place. And when it comes to the Battle of Jericho, we've got a lot of it. See, we know exactly where Jericho is at. We know the old city. It's what you see there in the bottom right. On the top left, I could have said this, worded this differently when I said it's the city during the time of Joshua. But what I mean is, as they've done excavations, right, ancient cities, they just build on top of each other. They don't demolish a building and create something new right in the exact same location. There's layers and layers upon these old cities. And so what you see in the top left is part of the excavation. That photo's almost 100 years old. But that is what Jericho would have looked like when Israel was fighting against it here in the book of Joshua. And then, on the bottom right, that's what Jericho looks like today. Those big grooves that you see in the ground, those have been different archaeological digs that have taken place. And they need to look down, kind of like layers in a rock formation, sedimentary rock, that you can go down through history and see things that have happened. They needed to dig down to be able to find these places. But it's not just that we know that Jericho exists or where it was, but there's 3 key pieces of information that we have that I think you'll find interesting. The first, according with Joshua 6, chapter 1, is that there is a surplus of pottery filled with grain that they found in Jericho, which fits both the season, being spring, and narrative that Jericho prepared for but didn't experience a siege. Why pots of grain are interesting? Because if you're looking at an ancient city and you find mass amount of food like they did here, numerous full clay jars that have survived the centuries, the eons here, the only time that you discover that kind of thing is if there was a cataclysmic event, right? Think of like Pompeii, something of that sort, where everything is just sort of frozen in time. And so they found all of these jars filled with grain. Not only do people eat it, but it's used as money back then. You would use it for trade purposes. And so the idea that there would just be all of this sitting around makes no sense. It supports the fact that they were ready and they had all of this food prepared for a siege, and they never needed it because God only took a week. Number 2 is this is where the walls of Jericho come crumbling down. We found the walls, and they fell down in an interesting way. So this is the ancient city of Jericho, basically rebuilt. And there's essentially 2 walls, okay? The top one is made of a different material. It's mud brick. The bottom wall is sort of that hard and thick stone, okay? The upper part of the city is where a lot of the rich folks would have lived. Rahab probably would have been in the space in between, living in the upper wall and the lower wall. But anyhow, when we find that the walls have fallen down, we might just think, when we read it, of a big wall just falling. But really what happened, if you read the text, is it says that the walls fell down, but that Israel was able to just walk straight into the city. It doesn't make any sense, especially when we look at the construction of Jericho, until they found that what happened was this upper wall up here exploded outwards and created a ramp such that Israel was able to walk straight up into the city. So what you saw in that photo, this is the lower wall, the big, thick stone wall, which is also right here. That's the same material. But what you see over here that he's pointing to is the mud brick section. that had come down and formed a ramp up the revetment wall. So the point is that the walls of Jericho fell down. They created a ramp so that Israel was able to climb the greatest obstacle of getting into the city, which is this, look at the guy here. Look how tall he is in comparison. That they were able to get past that. Third and finally, there was a great fire. The site that Jericho sits on, the layer that corresponds to the battle with Israel, because later on Jericho is rebuilt and other people live on it. But the site where the battle happened, that part of history, is covered with a meter of ash. Everything that is in the city during that time. And what you see in that photo are those jars of grain that I was talking about, but they're burnt on the inside. They're scorched. I've quoted here one of the archaeologists who was working on the site. She said, "The destruction was complete. Walls and floors were blackened or reddened by fire, and every room was filled with fallen bricks, timbers, and household utensils. In most rooms, the fallen debris was heavily burnt, but the collapse of the walls of the eastern rooms seemed to have taken place before they were affected by the fire." Joshua 6:24 tells us that the Lord told Israel to put Jericho to flame. So all of these things come together, and it's certainly not all of it. Jericho is one of the most well-researched archaeological sites in the world. Basically, outside of Jerusalem, people have been there for a long time digging. And what it has shown is that you can have every reason, if you want something outside of the Bible, to trust in this miraculous act, because over and over again, people who have no problem saying the Bible is incorrect have said that it matches the account presented in Joshua. As interesting as that is, and I love it, I had to cut a bunch of stuff. As interesting as this is not the point of Joshua 5 and 6. The point of Joshua 5 and 6 is that God is doing something with the nation of Israel that goes unseen to many of us. They are fighting a spiritual battle. Not all of the battles for the rest of Joshua are going to happen this way, but the first one, you could say the most important one, the one that kind of kicks off the storm, right? This one, God defeats this mighty stronghold of a city by his own power and his own strength, because it is not ultimately about the power of man in fighting these battles, even though that's part of it. Israel has a role to play, but it's a sort of supporting role. God is the one that is leading the charge here, and it is his accounting of events that takes place. Jericho surely has another narrative. They're terrified of what this God is going to do, and in fact, they were right to be terrified. Nobody can stand against the power of God, but we have to ask the question in our own lives, right? What does it look like to basically put on this lens to understand that the ultimate root cause of the pain and suffering in this world is sin? Yes, but sin brought about by an enemy that is powerful and wants to steal and kill and destroy. This is really who they are fighting against. It is not just the people of Jericho, but it is Satan himself. There's a passage in Ephesians that Paul writes to the church there at Ephesus that sounds like it could have come directly from Joshua chapter 6. "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers of this darkness, against evil spiritual forces in the heavens." All of those descriptors are synonyms, right? When it talks about rulers and authorities, it's not talking about kings and queens of the world. Paul is saying this battle that we wage in God's kingdom is not against flesh and blood. It's not against humanity, even though that's how many of our problems might manifest themselves. But rather there is something deeper. There's something going on behind the scenes. There is often an unseen war that is taking place. And here's my worry, is not that we would, or rather I should say maybe my encouragement. My encouragement is not that we should abdicate or fail to recognize that battles still take place in this world, but rather add on to that an entire sort of armory that God has given to us to be able to fight the most important part of these battles, which is the spiritual kind. Most of the time, we're like a horse with blinders on, and we just think of our troubles, our circumstances, our difficulties as if that's where they end. But rather, what the Bible tells us is that there is something deeper here, and that in order to fully and completely find victory, we have to consider all of the tools that God has given to our disposal. And so the first thing that we need to do is we need to be able to see the true battle here. You cannot fight it before you see it. And so you need to, if any of you like to fish, you know the benefit of having polarized glasses. Right? It takes the glare off of the water so that you can see the fish you're never going to catch, right? So we need to consider our problems like we're wearing these polarized sunglasses. Yes, what's going on is something that we can witness, but yet there's a way in which we can see even deeper into the water. We can go beneath the surface. This is why we started back in Joshua chapter 5 and not 6, where most of the conflict happens. It's because that interaction with the commander of the Lord's army is such a dramatic scene, right? One that ends so abruptly. You might recall, it just says at the end of chapter 5, it says, take off your shoes, and Joshua did that. Like our imaginations are left to run wild with, what was the rest of the conversation after he took off his shoes? I mean, like we just get the part where he was asking him whether he was an enemy combatant. But Joshua had this conversation with the Lord, and the Lord explained to him, hey, you are fighting something bigger than you realize, and I am with you, and I'm going to bring you victory. In fact, victory has already taken place. You just have to experience it, but you are fighting a different battle than you might think. Joshua was a military commander. This guy would get it. He knows strategy. He has led the nation of Israel in war even when Moses was alive. That was kind of his job. That was his gig. He was the general. And yet even he needed to recognize, which he did by faith, that there was a different battle going on. If you're familiar with that kind of street trick of the cup and ball, right, where they move them around, that is how the enemy wants us to think of our troubles in this world, right? Because if we're saying over and over again that there is something deeper here, there's more to it, there's an unseen aspect, then inevitably the question becomes, well, who is behind it all? And the answer to that is Satan himself. Yes, your problem might be a couple steps removed from that. I grant you. If you have a boss that's difficult, it doesn't mean that your boss is Satan, right? But as we go further back into these problems and we get to the root cause of it, even if you just want to say where sin has found its origin, we are talking about the enemy of the world and Satan himself and what he loves to do. And frankly, what he is far better at than we often give him credit is for confusing us and giving misdirection such that we don't recognize his role in what's going on. C.S. Lewis wrote a book called The Screwtape Letters, which some of you have read. And in that book, which is from the perspective of a demon writing helpful advice to a younger demon, the name of the elder demon is Screwtape. And in one of his letters, giving advice for how to defeat Christians, he says, there is nothing like suspense and anxiety for barricading a human's mind against the enemy. He wants men to be concerned with what they do. Our business is to keep them thinking about what will happen to them. And the point that he brings out here when he speaks of the enemy, he means God. He says there's nothing greater that can distance us in our relationship with God than by giving us all the trials and difficulties of this world, some of which we bring upon ourselves, some of which he brings upon us. But nevertheless, he is behind it all because he is the author of evil. And so if you can recognize simply the fact that he is crafty, that he is a thief, that he wants to cause disunity and division, He wants to separate you and isolate you. He wants to make you feel worthless. He wants to take you away from the love of God. He wants to do all manner of things that are terrible and horrible. There's a reason that the Bible describes him as a thief and a murderer, because he wants to steal and kill and destroy. If that is the culprit behind all of these things, which it is, then when we have made him out to be this cute little red figure wearing a cape and a pitchfork, twirling his mustache with a forked tail, right? We have done a disservice to our own faith by thinking he just sits on our shoulder and invites our worst impulses. He is a fallen angel who is trying to destroy you. And in order to understand the battle, you need to understand your greatest enemy, which is him. Now, when we think about seeing the true battle, naturally the question becomes, well, how must we fight the battle? Right? That's what we want to know. And that is the second part here. How might we fight the true battle? The great news is that God gives us an answer. In Ephesians, where he said that our battle is not against flesh and blood, right around that passage in chapter 6, you'll see that God gives a whole host of arrows that we might use to pierce the enemy and shields that we might use to defend ourselves against his advances. But the things that God lists, frankly, fall into the same category that the commands to the army fell into in Joshua chapter 6, such that at the outset, they don't sound all that powerful. It's things like truth and faith and preparation. It's the helmet of salvation. It's prayer. Things that you have heard over and over again. Things that we need to do that are helpful to us, that can give us the power to defeat the evil one by God's grace. And yet so often we look at them like, I would say if I was in Israel's army and Joshua was like, I just want you to walk around Jericho for a week. I'd be like, what? I have come all this way. We just crossed a really big river. And you want me to walk? You want me to walk behind the priests? When do you want me to use my sword? When do you want me? What about all this stuff that I would not be the first person to think that, or I might have been the first person maybe, to think that that was not the tactic that we should use. And that is how we look at these kinds of things, the tools of warfare that God has given to us. Is you hear the word prayer and you go, prayer. Why would I use prayer? Well, because you're not fighting a battle that you can see. You're not fighting a battle that is easy to recognize. And in fact, the enemy is one that you can't even defeat without the power of God's help, without his miraculous intervention. And so it's kind of like one of those action movies where they like open up the like gun safe and you're just like, where was this the entire time, right? That is what God is doing. He's availing us of this whole new armory. And it is upon us, and the correction is upon us if we look at all of these weapons of warfare and we go, well, why would I use those? And God says, because they defeat the enemy. Because they are the ones that put him on his heels. Because they are the ones that bring down the walls of Jericho. Hebrews chapter 11 says the reason the walls of Jericho came crumbling down, yes, because of God's power, but because Israel believed and had faith that it would happen. They used God's weapons, and it tended to be pretty effective, as we see in the story. So, if you have a strained marriage, a difficult boss, if you are suffering with loneliness, if you have an addiction that you can't break, whatever the battle is, my point is not that those are not physical or emotional battles, but rather that the ultimate solution to them is going to be fighting the spiritual battle. And that the root cause of your pain is not in interpersonal conflict. It is not in the cancer that is in your body, but it is in the enemy that is trying to steal and kill and destroy. There are some battles that we face in this life that we will not have victory over until Christ returns. There are some things that persist. Not every single battle that we face has a neat conclusion and a bow that gets tied on it, like Jericho, right? But the point of the matter here is that if you want to fight, and if you want to have victory, you need to use the tools that God has given you to use. Here's where I add just a little bit of nuance, though, a little context. Is the encouragement here, though, is not that Israel never used their swords, but much like last week, we said God parted the waters and Israel walked through. God brought down the walls of Jericho and Israel ran up the ramp. In your own life, you're facing battles. The key to finding victory is viewing them the way that God views them and using his tools for warfare, but it doesn't mean you're exempted from the fight. In our own life, right? I mean, let's talk about Roger Bannister, the guy who broke the 4-minute mile. I have never had a body that could run a 4-minute mile, okay? Not something the Lord gave me. My track coach back in high school said something much to the contrary, okay? But Roger still needed to run a 4-minute mile and have a body that could do it, even though there was another battle he needed to consider, an even more important one, the mental battle. In our own lives, God still gives us many tools that we can use that are all part of this comprehensive vision for fighting against the enemy. So, to wit, I go see a therapist, I take medicine when I'm sick, I eat my vegetables, and when I have a hard relationship, I have hard conversations. Like, I don't sit back as the Christian Science practitioner might, of which Christian is not a name that should be attached to them, and they say, well, because God can heal, he is going to do everything. He might, but the point of wisdom was not that you abdicate your entire responsibility in this journey. And so therefore, a fully formed version of warfare in this world, as it is still physical and emotional, as well as spiritual, is that we use all of the weapons and the armory that we have. We put on all of the armor of God that he tells us about in Ephesians, and then we go into battle. The reason I brought this up and the reason I wanted to talk about it this morning, amongst many, frankly, of the lessons that could come out of the Battle of Jericho, is because I think we just neglect the spiritual side of battle. We've got the other side locked down. We know how to fight it using the tools of this world, but you've probably experienced it doesn't ultimately result in victory most of the time. It's kind of like a dandelion, right? This spring, you can just keep mowing over the dandelions in your yard, and they'll come back a week later. Or you can take a shovel and you can dig up the root and it won't come back again. The encouragement is not to stop fighting battles a certain way, but to recognize that there's a whole component and root cause to sin and battles that we often neglect. One final thing, because it's easy and nice to go back to the Battle of Jericho and talk about victory, but you go, what about right now? What about my battles today, right? After the first service, I was talking with somebody who came up to me and they said, whenever the Chiefs play, I record the game. And if they win, I go back and watch the game. I said, are you going to record tonight? But they said, I go back and watch the game because it is so much easier to be able to watch the interceptions and the fumbles and all of those things happen if you know the outcome, right? Revelation is the outcome. When John receives the vision on the island from the Lord, he's in the future, far past us. God gives him a glimpse into what is coming. And so, different than the way that you might see prophecy in the Old Testament, where God tells them what is going to happen, John is describing something that for him was a present and active memory. God let him see Satan being drawn down into the depths of hell to suffer his eternal punishment that he deserves. Hell is not the abode of Satan where he hangs out in lukewarm water, okay? Hell is where he goes to be punished along with everybody, all the other enemies of God. And so in the battles that you're facing, recognizing that they are more spiritual than they are physical and emotional, though it is all of the above, you need to remember that you have already won if you trust in Christ. You are not fighting a battle that you will ultimately fail, even if it's one that takes you to the end of your life. You have victory, because in that case, you will rise again from the dead. All of the battles that you are facing, every single one of them, finds its ultimate victory in Jesus Christ. And if you want to find that victory, you need to trust in him as your Savior. Otherwise, your end is the same as the devil's. That's the choice that God gives to us. So we can have victory in our battle, or we can choose to reject that. We can choose to fight the battles that we want to fight under our own power, disregarding God's will, furthermore, disregarding the blood of Christ that enables us in his Holy Spirit, which empowers us to be able to take on these battles in the first place. We can neglect all of that. And in the immediate sense, yes, you won't find total victory, but there is a far greater consequence, right? There's a far greater consequence to being the enemy of God, which is that when he comes, you might think that you are Jericho and you are ready to handle him. And you are ready to handle anything that he might throw your way. You get to the end of this life and you say, I have a few words that I'd like to give to him. Your walls are going to come crumbling down. You will not be able to withstand him. And everything that was built up in anticipation of that moment will be burned like jars of grain. It would be better to be on the other side. It would be better to be on the team that trusted in the Lord and his plan of salvation, and the one that he has freely given to anybody who would trust in Christ. That's the victory that you can have today if you want it. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we come before you, King of the universe, Creator and Savior of mankind. Lord, we are fighting battles today that it certainly feels like we're losing, that we cannot win. God, remind us of the power that you have. Remind us of the purpose that you have given to us and the plan that you have for the future, which to you, Lord, is the present. God, in Christ alone, we have victory already assured. And we know the outcome. So it makes it a little bit easier to walk through this life and see the fumbles, because, Lord, we know that you are working things towards your ultimate end. God, we ask for the strength of Joshua and the army of Israel as they went up against Jericho. The faith to trust that you are going to do the things that you say you'll do. Lord, the faith to believe that the weapons of warfare you've outlined are powerful, because, God, we know they are. And that you'll give us discernment and great insight to be able to see the true enemy behind the battles that we face, Lord. To understand the spiritual warfare that is taking place. To not be fooled by Satan's misdirection. To not be able to recognize his power ultimately, Lord, that is behind so much destruction. God, help us to remember that you are the victor, and that, Lord, by trusting in you, we are victorious as well. Lord, I pray for anybody who is in the midst of a battle right now, or a battle that is coming in the future, that you would give them the peace that surpasses all understanding and help them to see the walls of Jericho fall down in this lifetime, Lord. It's in your Son's name that we pray. Amen. Amen. Hey, love you. See you next week. Bring somebody with you.
Welcome back to the studio. We're joined by Connor.
Hey-o.
And we're going to talk more about this sermon as per usual. Jason, you had a good question for Connor.
It's been burning on your mind.
I almost had a
Jason.
burning question, but then
I
considering
don't know how
what we're
burning
about,
it's been, but
yeah.
I mean, we kind of talked about this, set it up. We kind of talked about this 2 weeks ago, they're very close to the promised land.
Yeah.
And it's about ready for them to take over the promised land. And then it's like, oh, wait, we've got to do a few things here first.
Yeah.
And one of them was circumcise the males that hadn't been for 40 years, it seems like, because Moses had a circumcision.
Thousands,
right?
tens of thousands.
And then now it's like before they enter the promised land, we need to have another circumcision time.
Right.
Why in the world did they not do as they were born?
Well, that's a great question. And that's kind of the thing that we should all be asking when we read Joshua 5 here is, it's in a weird way, it's almost like this precursor to the failings of Israel as time goes on. It's like, okay, did they not learn their lesson? Right.
Is that like a foreshadowing of like?
I don't know if it is directly. I think the main part of Joshua 5 there, what is that, like 1 through 8 or something, where they go through the circumcision. I think the main teaching from that is they have realigned themselves with covenant faithfulness, and they are sort of back on the boat. But the secondary question certainly is like, why were they not already?
Yeah.
What has happened for 40 years? Especially, I mentioned it in the sermon, but like Exodus 4, Moses is almost killed because his son is not circumcised.
Right.
Like, this is
it's
a
not
huge
like
thing.
a small thing.
He had to lead all Israel through circumcision before they did the Passover the first time. Like, what was going on? But yeah, that's... we should see it as, okay, the army, it's this great leading up to moment of preparation before the battle. But yeah, I don't know that there's a good answer.
And certainly commitment wise, everyone was bought in.
Right.
Right. I mean, it shows that, but to me, it was like, and even when I reread chapter 5 after I listened to the sermon, it's like, it says the second circumcision, like they had the second circumcision.
Yeah.
I'm like, that is so interesting to me that they didn't keep up with the maintenance. I guess circumcision maintenance.
Yeah.
Well, when you're following a pillar of cloud or a pillar of fire, and you never know when it's going to move.
Like me,
it might be the kind of thing that you don't bother to.
I don't know. We can't wait 3 days to be out of commission here. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. I think maybe I'm reading too much into it. Tell me if you think I am. But when I think about us now, these days, when we face big challenges, it's easy for us to go, oh man, what happened? Where am I at my daily devotionals? We don't have the same kind of laws, but we have practices that when we feel like we're running on all the spiritual cylinders, it's easy for those things to fall to the wayside, which then I think folds into the bigger message of the sermon is that there is spiritual warfare happening everywhere.
Yeah.
And Satan would like nothing more than for us to backslide in some of those practices.
Also thought something I didn't think about, I don't think ever before, the Passover, their first Passover with the grains from the promised land.
Yeah.
So that's really cool.
Well, and it's really significant because then the manna stops, right? And so even the manna had gone in a bit, if you will, into the promised land. But it stopped.
Wean them off of that manna a little bit.
It stops at the day after the Passover.
Yeah. That's cool.
So cool. So significant.
Yeah.
Back to warfare. You talked about the preparation and the kind of warfare that was being waged.
Yeah.
And we talked about off camera total warfare, whether this is that kind of thing where they were going to go in and totally destroy. This is a different kind of warfare. This is the only time in Scripture, am I wrong, where it's really clear that they're being sent to do something that no one else had been sent to do, nor has been sent to do it in that way, walking around the tower.
Oh, well, that's certainly true. Yeah, nobody had that battle plan. As far as, so this word is harem, which is describes the nature of the combat that God has asked them to do. And it's the part of the text that can make us uncomfortable reading it. It's like you must kill everything that is basically moving, including the animals in these towns, burn it. So it's not the only place in Scripture that happens, but it is very selective. Like they won't do this with every city or nation they face in the Promised Land. And there are a couple of things to keep in mind, right? The first is that one, war today does not look like war back then. They are nation that is, speaking of Israel, representing God, even in a way that is different than the nation of Israel today. They are a nation representing God specifically. It is them against the gods of these other nations. That is not a stretch at all to be saying, like, that is how they are framing this warfare. That is how God views it multiple times. Goes back even to Exodus with Egypt. The rationale for God's judgment is to, bring punishment to those in rebellion, like Pharaoh. But the meaning behind the 10 plagues is to embarrass the gods of Egypt. Each one of them corresponds to an Egyptian god. And so the same thing's kind of happening here, is they're going to, they're doing this warfare, and it's going against the gods of the land. It's completely different than warfare today. God was very circumspect, though, and only delivering it in these particular circumstances. There have been a couple that have happened before in Numbers, and then there will be one or two more that happen. I can't remember exactly in Joshua. But the point is not that every city and town that Israel faces goes through this type of destruction. In fact, in 2 weeks, Jim will be preaching on a message with the Gibeonites, who come and ask for peace with Israel. And this was a provision that God had, was like, if they are understand that I am coming through and they submit to you, and this kind of thing was possible. The other thing to understand too is, and this flows out from the idea that it was holy warfare, the word harem talks about, or gives the idea, that word is also used for something that is devoted in a sacrifice. And in fact, it has to do with something that is like burned and given over such that it can't be retrieved. It's a permanent sacrifice. And so there was a way in which these cities, which we might remember God had talked about bringing judgment upon back in Genesis. And he's like, hey, the sins of, this is in Genesis 15:16, and even later in Leviticus 18, we learn some of the terrible things that the Canaanites and other people in the land are doing. And you're just sort of, anytime they're brought up from Genesis on, like, you recognize that the Lord is furious with what they are doing in his promised land, and that they are just inviting destruction upon themselves, but that it was kind of this slow boil. That back in Genesis, hundreds and hundreds of years beforehand, when Abraham was in the land with them, they were doing some of these things, but God says, like, their sin has not yet reached its full measure. A full judgment will come at a more appropriate time. Well, now we see, when Israel arrives on the scene, Jericho and others, it's at a rolling boil. It's time. And so I think sometimes people can take the framework of sort of colonialism or manifest destiny and just sort of impart that into the narrative of Israel, that they were just sort of taking over the land and driving out the natives. And that is not at all the context of what's going on here. This was a land that they had lived in first. This was a land that God had promised to them. Not only was Israel receiving the promised land, but as a dual sort of effect, they were driving out the sinful nations. Like, there were so many things going on here. And so viewing this, even though it can be uncomfortable to read those sections, right, we have to keep in mind, like the Gibeonites, God allows nations to avoid this punishment. So that's sort of a corporate example. You have the individual example of people like Rahab.
Right. I was thinking of that because she was saved through even though it said totally
and in fact,
annihilated.
Her whole family, right. Her faith saves her whole family, even though we
don't know what their circumstances, like the other.
Yeah, we don't know.
We don't know what they were
doing. Her whole family was saved because of this. And then the last thing, and we'll see this next week when we get to the Battle of Ai, is that this standard of perfect holiness was not just like, what do I want to say? That Israel was held to the same standard. This goes back to the circumcision. This goes back to Passover. But later, when Achan disobeys some of the commands that God gives Israel about attacking this next city, God delivers significant and exacting punishment upon Achan and sort of his family for the same sort of thing. And so it's important to see that the same measure is kind of being applied here, even though God was using his chosen people to deliver it.
Severe punishment with the golden calf too, even going farther back.
Yeah.
That we saw that too.
Yeah.
Right. And
some people forget that they went through with a sword.
Yeah. Right.
Killed a lot of people. There were a lot of plagues in Numbers when people did the things that they weren't supposed to. So
I really appreciated when you went a little deeper on the verse where we are, and I'm sorry, I'm not thinking of the words right now, but you were talking about officials, authorities.
Oh, leaders. Sure, in Ephesians, rulers and authorities.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You clearly distinctively said, this is not against the people who are in the offices.
Yeah.
Right now. Because then I think especially, it's real easy when our guy or gal isn't in office, they're the enemy, and
sure.
And it's easy to use verses like that against people who we don't agree with here and in other countries too. Yeah. And so to make a distinction that we're talking about the demonic forces.
Yeah, absolutely.
Here,
Romans uses, it's Paul speaking about, but Romans uses similar language in the passage about that nothing can separate us from the love of God. Mm-hmm. Similar language in there of sort of authorities and powers. And it's like all speaking of the dramatic evil one and sort of his host.
Yeah, yeah. I always enjoy when we talk about archaeology.
Yeah.
So thank you for giving us the photographs, the drawings of the very accurate photographs of Jericho. That was really interesting to see the two walls. I guess I'd never really considered it that way in my mind.
Well, fair enough. The text just says the wall. Mm-hmm. And so it is interesting that as we, no pun intended, but have dug deeper into that kind of stuff, right? That now we sort of have a greater context to what was going on.
Well, it's interesting for me to think about them being able to scale the wall instead of just like somehow walking between pieces of rubble that had got that, kind of thing. So that's interesting.
This was a thriving, vital city center at the time. And so, it was fortified and it was strong. And when we see the ruins, it's kind of hard to visualize
the grain, seeing that the grain and they had. To me, when you were talking about that, I was like, man, that was where their trust was. We said it was going to be God versus God, and they had their gods, but they're just like, we have the walls, we have the food, we have the water. We're good. We'll just wait them out. Anyone out,
Mm-hmm. Yes, we do. It's funny. Somebody sent me the VeggieTales version of Jericho the other day, where they're throwing the purple smoothies at them, and for some reason everybody in Jericho is French.
Yes,
but
it's the peas, right?
Yeah, it was the peas.
It's much more fun.
But it is. We do need to balance it with they had that battle plan. They probably thought it was going to work, but they are terrified.
Right.
So we have to keep that in mind as well. Like that's the beginning of 5 or 6, I can't remember, but that they are there. It's beginning of 5, excuse me, that they're terrified of Israel now that they've crossed the Jordan. So that, and I just bring that up because that will be important to understand why some of the nations act as they do as we go through Joshua, is that they're scared of who's coming. But you're right. Best laid plans.
Right.
Of peas and carrots.
Yeah. Of peas and carrots.
Here's one fun fact from the archaeology stuff that was not maybe fun.
It sounds like you could have talked a lot more about that.
Well, I could talk for a little bit. Jim could talk for a long time. But Jericho's fun because it's one of the, outside of Jerusalem, one of the best studied locations. And so there's just a lot of evidence has been built upon it. And what is also fun is it's revealing this miraculous story instead of some of the other discoveries we might find are unbelievably significant. Finding the city of David was huge, all of these kinds of things, but it feels to me like it's on level with hey, we're finding Noah's Ark, sort of like it's this huge moment.
It's not just a name on a stone that proves that the Bible has a ruler here. Exactly. It's like, this happened and this happened.
And you have multiple people who've gone back. Now, the dating, if you get into it, the dating of Jericho is as is with the whole Exodus movement, is debated. But sort of what I'll skip to the end. The thing that I don't want to say nail in the coffin, but really since the 90s, the opinion has held pretty solid about the consistency of Jericho being the appropriate, all of the stuff that we talked about, them finding it, being in the right timeline, had to do with some pottery. And I don't mean the stuff that held grain, but like decorative pottery. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole science, and as you imagine, people with PhDs who study, late Bronze Age Canaanite pottery. And to make a long story short, that was really the tip off. That because they had found a lot of these things, and then they had used various dating methods. For example, one of them, they looked so the space in between the top wall and the bottom wall, it was basically the poorer part of the city. Well, that's where they originally did some digging. And so because of that, one of the original conclusions, this is like 100 years ago, one of the original conclusions was, well, it was actually a city of poor people. Nobody there was of any means. And so this narrative that it was this mighty city, well, that doesn't make any sense because look at the types of pottery we found. Mm-hmm. But since then, as they've excavated other sections, realized, oh, well, okay, we were kind of in the not best. We were in the poor area where Rahab lived, right? Yeah. Once we go on top of the city, now we're finding some more decorative pottery, and the people with PhDs in their Bronze Age, all of the understand those things. They'll say, look, the only time that this type of hatching in this particular color pattern was occurring when they were trading with this particular nation, but it was right in our timeline here. It matches everything that we're doing. And so it's just fun when those things bring it together.
Can I just say I love it when scholars who maybe aren't followers of Jesus, but are very, very intelligent, well-studied, come up with discoveries that support the Bible.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
I just love it. Yeah. Because it makes it easier when apologetics, when we're trying to explain to people, our faith, but not using spiritual or Christian terms to do it, using other scientific kinds of things. Yeah. It just helps support that. So very cool. Well, the thing we would all love to know, and I'm going to guess we may not walk away with an answer today, but who appeared to Joshua?
Yeah. Who is the captain of the Lord's army?
Yes.
So there are three kind of possible answers here. But the bridge, or the river, is going to split here very early on with whether it was an angel or God. And then if you think it's God, then it splits one more time. Right. So, okay.
Those sound like rabbit holes.
Right? So the big one is, was this an angel, i.e. was this like Michael, an archangel? Was this an angel, or was this the Lord himself? So briefly, reasons why we might think that this is the Lord, okay, is first of all, that it seems like Joshua bows down in worship to this individual. And he bows his head and he's, what does my Lord want to tell me? Right. And that this individual seems to speak with a kind of authority that is a little bit different than when we hear angels speak elsewhere. Right. Honestly, cryptic. It's sort of incomplete. We get the very beginning of their interaction. We presume much happened after this that we don't know about. It's just finishes with Joshua bowing down with his sandals off. But another great parallel is that there are so many things, and I haven't really emphasized them in the sermons, but there are a lot of things in Joshua that show how he is a parallel character to Moses. Like in a literary sense, but also theologically.
This was kind of his burning bush moment.
Was his burning bush. Exactly.
Nicely done.
This was his burning bush moment. So Moses, in the beginning of Exodus, is out in the wilderness of Midian, and he sees the burning bush, and he goes there, and it's the Lord. And this is Moses says, well, when you tell me to go and rescue the people, and they say, who sent me? Who should I say has sent me? And the Lord says, I am who I am. Tell them I am sent you. They're definitely in Exodus. It really not having questions. It is God it seems to be not a human form, which is a distinction here. The Lord is speaking through sort of this fire, but even down to the point of taking off your sandals, right? Because this is holy ground. That would imply
you're on holy ground.
Same thing happens here. So the fact that Joshua has consistently been pushed forward as this sort of the next Moses, and that there are multiple things. There was another one when they crossed the Jordan, that one of the effects was that it cemented the status of Joshua as the leader of Israel in the same way that the crossing of the Red Sea cemented Moses' status as the leader of Israel. So those things sort of push towards this idea that, hey, this is probably God. If you go to the other side, if you say, well, maybe this is an angel, like an archangel. So you could also view his bowing down and taking off his shoes as something that doesn't need to happen because it's the Lord. In other words, that there wasn't anything that particularly took place where Joshua began to worship the figure themselves, but rather he's bowing down in reverence. Like he obviously recognizes that this is a divine interaction, that there is a lot of sort of holy weight behind what's being said and who he's speaking to. But him simply bowing down and then asking what the Lord would have him know, perhaps he's asking the angel to communicate an idea.
Right. You would ask an ambassador that.
Or like, why are you here? What do I need to know? Like, I mean, you're here for a reason.
But his deference does not have to be, or it can be explained in another way.
It's not necessarily worship.
Yeah. In the respect of the divine that we'd be talking about. And then the other one is simply the fact that it uses the term angel over and over, malach, which means messenger. And so it's interesting that the angel, that God would consistently refer to himself in that capacity or not identify himself in a more fulsome way like he does in so many other interactions. But again, it's kind of inconclusive. However, I think the majority of evangelical scholars would go in the direction of this is God. There are things that seem unusual about this, but this is probably God. And then the other two options that are at the end of that line are this is a theophany, which is sort of the general term to describe God appearing. And we don't go much more specific than that. We just say God appeared to them. It's an appearance of God. Or the more specific, Christophany.
One of my favorite buzzwords.
Here we go.
Yeah.
And we don't, if anybody's wondering, we don't really have words for like an appearance of the Father, an appearance of the Spirit, even though that takes place, but an appearance of the Son, Jesus. That is rooted more in this New Testament sense that, like John 1, the Word was made flesh, that basically anytime that God is appearing in the Old Testament, it must be Jesus, because that is sort of, I mean, God is spirit. If we're just talking about God as one, God is spirit. Yet, what do we do with the multiple instances where in this case, Joshua 5, he appears as a man with a sword drawn that to Joshua's first impression looks no different than a normal Israelite man or Canaanite man. So there's a kind of a quick we're in a further rabbit trail to go down though that complicates this a bit more, which is you have to just start looking at the other places where God appears to people. And there's a case with Abraham that kind of makes this difficult to understand, or I should say to land on a solid answer. So in Genesis 17, God appears, it's not the only time, but God appears to Abraham. And we don't get much about the interaction, but it does say at the very beginning of chapter 17, the Lord appeared to Abraham. It's not, he talked with him. It's like Abraham and God saw each other. Amazing. And then it kind of moves past into what the Lord said. But in Genesis 18, this is the story, if people are familiar, where there are three strangers that come to the tent of Abraham and Sarah, and Abraham prepares a meal for them. This is right before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And what's interesting is that in these two interactions, one chapter apart, Abraham does not seem to recognize at first the figure or the significance of the Lord. And we are told very clearly it is the Lord who comes to speak with Abraham. There's a bit of ambiguity on, if the Lord is kind of represented by these three people.
Yeah.
I don't know if I dive into that.
They're the ones that go into Sodom and Gomorrah, right?
Well, they talk with him at the top.
They're not the ones that go.
They're
in.
not
there are two angels that go in.
Right, okay.
Mhm.
Okay.
Which sort of adds to this as well. Is that
Right.
those are distinguished. There's two angels that go in.
And these are different.
Two different groups.
Okay.
The three that come to Abraham are the one that it's the whole thing with Sarah, and she laughs, and why did you laugh, and all of
when
that.
They have a baby.
But if Abraham had seen the Lord, which he did in Genesis 17, it's interesting that then there's a different form, if you will, that the Lord takes.
He didn't immediately say, "Oh, there's the Lord."
Genesis 18. And so you look at those examples, and you're like, okay, well, he definitely met the Lord, and then he didn't seem to So is God taking different forms? Okay, when Jacob wrestles with the man who is clearly God,
Yes.
Yeah.
are we? And I'm just kind of asking provoking questions here, but it's like, are we thinking that this is the same one who is sort of appearing in every single circumstance? And if it is Christ, I mean, then that would mean that we have this defined vision of what God looks, or of what Christ looks like far before he appears. I'll dive into a conversation Jim and I were having last week about this, which gets into the complication that before the incarnation, which is Jesus in a manger, the theological significance of that is that God takes on human nature. Okay. Christ existed from the foundation of the world. He is eternally begotten by the Father, but he did not take on human flesh until the incarnation. And so you're asking,
that's the first time that it happened.
Well, it's not necessarily the first time that a Christophany happened. I don't think you can make that.
But that was the first time
that's when he's got human nature.
Right.
Yes. Before that time, he doesn't.
May have looked like a human before then.
And we're in keen speculation mode here, right?
Right.
It's not an area
But you get into these
operate
questions,
really
like I was talking with
in.
Jim, and I was like, okay, so Jesus, he's fully man, fully God. He's got human DNA, right? I would hedge my bets that whether it's random DNA or something from Mary, it's probably from Mary. Or, I mean, there's this whole idea of the bloodline, the Davidic bloodline, and all of these things. It would be significant. He should probably have that DNA. And so there's probably some measure of genetic coding with Christ and the way that he looks. And so you're like, okay, so 33-year-old Jesus, when he's dying, or just, I should just say, when he's an adult, the way that he looks, which is sort of this determined thing based upon all the stuff we just talked about. Is that what he looks like in the Old Testament when he's appearing as this figure? Like, are we, what is going on here? Because I think you'd have problems with the Christophany of Jesus appearing with human flesh. And again, I'm distinguishing the form of a man versus becoming a man.
Right.
But anyhow,
Connor, this is all very interesting to consider. But regardless of the answer, which I hope we'll find out when we get to heaven, does it change the message?
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
It doesn't. Not one bit. And I think that, frankly, for all of this yammering that I'm doing, we need to be careful about being, I would even say, like, dogmatic, that the angel of the Lord, or the captain of the Lord's army in Joshua 5 is XYZ. It very well could be Jesus. And I'm getting into weird things that God is like, yeah, I handle that with a snap of my fingers, and that every time that the Lord appears, that it is, Christ. That very well could be the case. It could very well be that it is just a manifestation of God, and that there are multiple times where he sort of presents himself as a different type of figure in a way that is not shocking and alarming to humans.
Right.
Because when angels appear, we hear, do not be afraid. And I don't know if that's because they came from out of nowhere or because they have some appearance to them that might be a little frightening.
I think that there is something about it that is shocking. And even if we go, and I should say, and if you go with the theophany or Christophany, it's very clear that God appearing to Joshua is not the way that God appears in the heavenly realms. Mm-hmm. No matter what version you want to take, there is some transmission going on here where he is taking a far more subdued form than, the stuff we see in Revelation. I mean, talk about Isaiah when he goes into the throne room of God and he's awestruck and can't speak and all of this stuff. It's like, that's not, whether it was an angel or whether it was God, neither one of them are presenting the same shocking image that accompanies their full glory.
Because we've heard so much through the last 5 books of the Bible that no one can see the face of God and live. Yeah. And we have to stay away from the Holy of Holies. And, that whole, this is still during those times because Jesus hasn't taken on that form yet, hasn't bridged that gap that Joshua could not have seen the full glory of God, but it could have been part of God.
I think it could absolutely be God. And I guess if somebody were, telling me they held one view over the other, my opinion is let them.
For this year, let them.
Let them.
There's like a whole movement, a let them movement. Yeah. Okay.
But I don't think that's what it usually is not in reference to, but
No, probably not. The important things though is from that conversation are we need to do what Joshua did when God is appearing to us or God is leading us, God is giving us a prompting. We need to bow down in reverence. We need to respect that. We need to honor him. And as you said later in the message, we need to be perceptive to all the spiritual things around us that are for us or against us and call them what they are.
I mean, the message of that individual at the end of Joshua 5 was, you are in something bigger, basically. Mm-hmm. Are you going to be on God's side? This is not, am I on your side or that one? It's not about
I'm
that.
On your side or their side. It's I'm on God's side.
Yeah, it's not neither. Right. It's I'm not about that. It's are you on my side? And that's always a good question for us to ask ourselves. Are we on the Lord's side in these battles?
Mm-hmm. Good conversation. Yeah, good question. My brain hurts a little bit more than usual. That means we've had a good extra. Guys, thank you so much. We will continue Joshua this Sunday, and you can bet more or less, probably, unless Jesus comes back. We'll be back here next week to talk about it.
That's a good guess. Here we go.
Thanks for tuning in. Have a great rest of your week.
Thank you for listening to the TBC Extra Podcast. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.